Imagine, you're a German Jew in the 1930s, sitting around the dinner table with your family. Life feels normal, even pleasant,
Yeah.
right? But outside, there's this storm brewing, fueled by an ideology that threatens everything. This is the reality German Jews faced. And today we're going to deep dive into how a modern nation could fall prey to such insidious hate.
Yeah, it's really unnerving how early the warning signs were there. We actually have an interview with Hitler from 1922, years before he came to power, where he openly states his goal, the annihilation of the Jews. He uses terms like gallows and extermination, really chilling stuff, especially knowing what comes later. It wasn't just politics, it was deep-seated hate. And understanding how this resonated with the nation is really crucial.
It's almost unimaginable that someone could speak so openly about these horrific plans and actually find an audience. So how did they turn such venomous ideas into an actual political movement?
They were masters at exploiting anxieties, pre-existing anxieties, and resentment. Germany, after World War I, was a nation dealing with defeat, economic hardship, humiliation. The Nazis didn't invent anti-Semitism, but they weaponized it. They made Jews the scapegoats for all the nation's problems.
So they tapped into this existing prejudice and just amplified it. Did they frame it purely as a nationalistic thing? Or were there other elements at play?
It was more complex than that. They really wove this tapestry of fear, combining political, social, even religious threads. They painted Jews not just as a threat to Germany, but as this almost satanic force aiming to corrupt Western civilization. A really potent mix designed to tap into those deep-seated fears.
It's chilling how they combine this national revival with this almost apocalyptic fear of cultural contamination. Like
Yeah.
Germany's survival depended on eliminating this enemy within.
Exactly. And what's even more disturbing is how they implemented this persecution. It wasn't an explosion of violence, but a calculated step-by-step escalation. This fits and starts approach, as historians call it, really lulled a lot of Jews into a false sense of security.
So you're saying it wasn't isolated incidents, but a deliberate strategy. Tightening the screws bit by bit. It's almost more insidious that way, making it hard to see the real danger until it's too late.
Precisely. Take, for instance, the boycott of Jewish businesses in April 1933. This was a state-sanctioned, very public display of anti-Semitism. Stormtroopers intimidating customers, creating this atmosphere of fear. But interestingly, many Germans just ignored it.
So there's pushback, even at that early stage. That's a glimmer of hope in all of this.
Yeah, it was a setback for the Nazis. Goebbels, the propaganda minister, was furious. He had hoped for this outpouring of support,
Hmm.
but it didn't happen. And the boycott was abandoned after just a few days.
That's fascinating. It suggests that their grip on the public wasn't as total as we often think. Even with this organized hate, there were cracks.
Absolutely. It really speaks to the complex reality of public opinion at the time. It wasn't just this uniform wave of anti-Semitism. It was a mix of views. Some supportive, some opposed, and many just caught in between.
This silent majority is an interesting group. What do you think they were thinking? Just afraid? Or did some believe the Nazi rhetoric?
It's a question historians are still grappling with. The Nazis created this climate of fear where speaking out could have serious consequences. So it's hard to separate genuine support from coerced compliance.
It makes you wonder how much silence contributes to the growth of evil.
Absolutely. A question worth pondering. And it leads to another disturbing aspect. The concept of working towards the Führer.
You mentioned that before. Can you explain what it means, how it factored into this?
It shows this really disturbing dynamic within the Nazi Party. Basically, lower-ranking officials would often take the initiative, implementing anti-Semitic measures that went beyond even Hitler's orders.
So they were proactively trying to outdo each other in their cruelty, all to prove loyalty to Hitler.
Exactly. A race to the bottom, where individuals wanted to prove their devotion by being the most ruthless. It created a situation where anti-Semitism could fester, often at a local level, away from Berlin.
That's a terrifying thought, this self-perpetuating cycle of hate. And against this backdrop, we see the introduction of the Nuremberg Laws in 1935. Now the persecution is being codified into law.
The Nuremberg Laws were a turning point, moving from random acts of discrimination to a legal framework for excluding Jews from German society. They chipped away at the foundations of Jewish life.
So it's not just mobs anymore, but the full power of the state against this minority. What did these laws actually entail?
The first, the flag law, seems symbolic, but it was significant. It declared the swastika the official flag of the Reich, tying the Nazi Party to the nation's identity. Then came the citizenship law, stripping Jews of German citizenship. They were now second-class subjects in their own country.
They became strangers in their own land. Everything they knew was suddenly in jeopardy.
And it gets worse. The law for the protection of German blood outlawed marriage and even sexual relationships between Jews and non-Jews, a direct attack on human connection, trying to control people's lives.
That's just unbelievable. Even associating with a Jewish person was dangerous. This level of social control is hard to fathom.
The insidiousness of the Nuremberg laws was their scope. They aimed to control not just public life, but also private aspects, who you could love, who you could have a family with, and attempt to purify the German race.
A stark reminder of how easily pseudoscience and bigotry can be used to justify inhumane acts. And to enforce these laws, they turned to the SS, already known for their brutality.
The SS, led by Himmler, became the enforcers of this racial purity, tasked with investigating and punishing anyone who defied the laws. This was a shift towards a more intrusive form of persecution.
So now it's not just the legal system, but a dedicated force, empowered to intrude into people's homes, their relationships.
Exactly. And as horrifying as all this is, there's another layer. The Nazis themselves struggled to define who was Jewish. They tried to square their belief in biological Jewishness with the reality of mixed heritage and religious practice. This created immense confusion and fear.
So it wasn't just about religion or culture. Even having a Jewish grandparent could put you at risk.
Right. This ambiguity became a weapon itself, breeding paranoia. People desperately tried to prove their Aryan lineage, terrified of being caught in this net.
A chilling reminder of how easily categories like race can be twisted to serve an ideology.
Absolutely. And then, just when it seemed things couldn't get worse, something strange happened. Leading up to the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, the Nazis toned down their anti-Semitism.
They were on the world stage. They needed to project a certain image, a cynical manipulation of how they were perceived.
Unfortunately, that's right. They were masters of propaganda. And tragically, this temporary calm had a terrible impact on many Jews.
They saw it as things improving, that maybe the worst was over.
Exactly. It lulled them into this false sense of security, this dangerous belief that maybe the Nazi regime was softening. Yeah, it was all a facade for the world to see. Behind the scenes, the persecution was still going strong.
So even while they were putting on this show of tolerance, their plans for the final solution were being developed.
The ideology was already there. And as the 1930s went on, the Nazis just got bolder. They really ramped up the pressure to push Jews out of German life. Businesses, professionals, cultural institutions, everything.
And they were trying to erase any trace of Jewish contributions, to rewrite history with this purely Aryan narrative.
Exactly. Trying to wipe out anything that didn't fit their ideology. And during this period, a very sinister figure emerges, Adolf Eichmann.
Eichmann, a name synonymous with the Holocaust. What was his role in all of this?
At this point, Eichmann was still kind of low-level in the SS, but he was gaining influence. He was obsessed with what he called forced emigration, finding ways to force Jews out. He even went to Palestine to explore mass resettlement, but that didn't work out.
So they were actively trying to expel Jews, but hadn't yet gone to the extreme of mass murder. It's chilling that at this point they saw expulsion as the solution, uprooting people, forcing them into an uncertain future.
It shows you the twisted logic of the Nazi regime. They were so obsessed with this idea of racial purity that they couldn't even stand the thought of Jews remaining in Germany, even if it meant pushing them toward potential enemies.
And tragically, many Jews were hesitant to leave. They had faced years of discrimination, weathered other storms, and clung to the hope that things might get better. They couldn't, or wouldn't, imagine what awaited them.
Many felt deeply rooted in Germany. Their families had been there for generations. They'd contributed to society, fought in wars. Leaving their homeland was a truly agonizing thought.
A classic case of denial, isn't it? When you're faced with something so terrible, it's easier to hold on to hope, to believe it can't really be that bad.
And the Nazis knew how to manipulate that. They would alternate between periods of intense persecution and then some brief periods of calm. It created this climate of uncertainty, made it hard to make rational decisions.
A psychological tactic to wear people down, make them more likely to just accept whatever was coming.
As the decade went on, the pressure increased restrictions on movement, education, even just interacting with non-Jews.
They were being isolated, pushed to the edges of society, Classic dehumanization, making it easier for others to ignore their suffering, even condone it.
Exactly. And a key point is that the Nazis were very good at creating a culture of complicity. They got everyday citizens involved in enforcing their policies, teachers reporting on students, shopkeepers refusing service to Jews.
It's disturbing to think that these small acts, these betrayals, contributed to this massive machine of persecution.
Each act chipped away at basic human decency, broke down community bonds, and paved the way for worse things to come. As Germany prepared for war, this obsession with the Jewish problem became even more urgent.
This is where we see the path to the Holocaust becoming clearer. The persecution, the dehumanization, the increasing acceptance of violence as a solution.
Tragically, yes. And as we move into the late 1930s, there's a horrifying event that really crystallizes this shift. Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass.
Kristallnacht. Just the name evokes such powerful images of destruction and terror. A night that seared into history.
On November 9th and 10th, 1938, this wave of violence swept through Germany and Austria. Synagogues burned, Jewish businesses were vandalized, homes invaded, a night of pure terror fueled by years of hate-filled propaganda.
It's hard to grasp the scale of it, the destruction, the fear that must have gripped these communities. What could have possibly caused such an explosion of violence?
The immediate trigger was the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by a young Jewish refugee, Herschel Greenspan. He was desperate, distraught over his family being deported. The Nazis used this as an excuse to unleash this wave of terror against all Jews.
So they took the act of one individual and used it to justify collective punishment against an entire group. Classic scapegoating, using tragedy to advance their own agenda.
Exactly. The brutality was staggering. Over 90 Jews were murdered, thousands injured, 30,000 arrested and sent to camps. Synagogues, homes, businesses destroyed. The streets were covered in broken glass.
And all of this was sanctioned, encouraged even, by the Nazi regime. This wasn't just a mob, it was state-sponsored terror.
It was orchestrated from the top. Goebbels gave this fiery speech that night, inciting the violence. The police and fire departments were told to stand down. It was a deliberate show of force and their total disregard for Jewish lives.
So Kristallnacht was a turning point. This was a massive escalation of the persecution.
Absolutely. It was a clear sign that they were no longer satisfied with just marginalizing Jews. They were moving towards eliminating them, erasing them from German society.
That's a terrifying thought. And it's hard to imagine the fear and despair German Jews must have felt. Their lives were shattered, their future completely uncertain, and the world seemed to be ignoring their plight.
And that feeling of isolation and abandonment would only grow worse in the years that followed. As the Nazi regime's plans for genocide took shape, leading to the horrors of the Holocaust.
We've been talking about this horrifying escalation of persecution against the Jews throughout the 1930s. And then Kristallnacht happens, this blatant act of violence. You'd think things couldn't get any worse after that.
Sadly, the aftermath of Kristallnacht just shows how committed they were to this genocidal path. Instead of facing condemnation from the world, they actually doubled down.
You're saying they just went on as if nothing happened.
It's worse, they used it to their advantage. They imposed this huge fine, 1 billion Reichsmarks, on the Jewish community to pay for the damages caused during Kristallnacht.
So they were punishing the victims for what was done to them. It's unbelievable.
It's a cruel twist, a prime example of how totalitarian regimes work. They manipulate logic, turn morality upside down. They use every event, even their own acts of barbarity, to push their agenda forward. And the persecution only got worse after Kristallnacht. More exclusion from public life, banned from schools, forced to wear identifying badges, making them targets.
It's like they were stripping away their humanity bit by bit, turning them into symbols to be hated.
Exactly, a deliberate strategy of dehumanization, making it easier for other Germans to look away from the suffering, or even to participate in the persecution. The psychological impact of this constant degradation, this attack on their identity, was immense.
It's a reminder of how fragile our societies are, how easily they can turn to barbarity when fear and hatred are allowed to grow.
And as we know, the story doesn't end there. Kristallnacht was a turning point, but it was just the beginning of the Nazis' plan for extermination. That plan ultimately led to the horrors of the Holocaust. Millions of Jews, along with others, murdered in camps. It's something we must never forget. A testament to human cruelty, but also a warning about the dangers of staying silent in the face of injustice.
It's a heavy thing to carry, this knowledge, but we have to share it. This responsibility to remember and learn from what happened, to try and build a future where these atrocities never happen again.
I agree. The story of the rise of Nazi anti-Semitism is full of pain, loss, and destruction. But it's also a story of resistance, of courage, of people who stood up against this tyranny and tried to protect those who were vulnerable. Even in the darkest of times, there's hope, and the human spirit endures.
This deep dive into Nazi anti-Semitism has been difficult, but important. We've explored how history, society, politics all came together to allow this hate to take root. We've seen the terrible consequences of prejudice, of staying silent and doing nothing. But it's also shown us how important it is to be vigilant, to speak out against injustice, to work towards a world where the Holocaust can never happen again. Keep learning from the past and commit to building a future where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Thank you for joining us.